those of you, if most of which I haven't met, I am originally from Amarillo, Texas, or Panhandle, Texas, and I live in Santa Fe now. I have for the last 8 or 9 years. I was a commercial artist for about 27 years, and in that time I ran an animation studio and commercial design and production, a video production company, done just about everything in the visual arts business. And then and I was trained in art school in design and illustration, but in the late 90s, I sold my business and went into full-time art. And shortly after that, I found out there was a big difference between commercial art and fine art. And one of the main differences was there were no rules in fine art, and at least no one was teaching them, with some exceptions. Everybody generally had the view, well, you just do what feels good. And I had a problem with that in commercial art. I had deadlines, I had budgets, and I had clients that I had to satisfy. And I realized in fine art, there's a problem when you have no limitations. And Orson Welles has a great quote, and I don't know exactly what it is, but it goes something like this: the greatest detriment to art is an absence of limitations. When I was in art school, we had projects, and the teacher would give us, okay, I want you to take a square and a triangle and white and black and make a design. Then he'd give us all these different parameters, and then the last part of the semester he says, okay, no rules, do anything you want. That was the hardest assignment we had. And so I found that in fine art that I felt, at least for myself, needed more structure. And also, it had been easy when I was painting on the weekends and just when I could. If things weren't going well, I'd just lay it off for a week or two and come back to it. But when I was in the business, painting every day, I found out that if every painting was a struggle and a painful, agonizing event where I felt from until maybe the very last 20 minutes of the painting, oh, this thing is going to be a disaster, and then maybe pull it together. That kind of frustration you can live with every so often, but you can't on a daily basis. You will burn out. So I started going to workshops. I decided that was an advanced degree as far as I was concerned, is going to workshops rather than trying to go to college and spend 2 or 3 years and thousands of dollars. I started going to workshops of people I admired, and many of them were exceptionally good teachers. And from my art school instructions and from my own reading and study and from these workshops, I put together, for my own purposes, I put together what I thought were the basic principles I had to master and I had to think about with every painting. And also a procedure that on every single painting I approached it the same way. I didn't reinvent the wheel every time I started a new painting. And it didn't make any difference whether it was a landscape, architectural, or portrait. And of course, I got this, I didn't come up with it out of my head, from some very good teachers. One in particular who was kind of my mentor, Ben Connis, taught this very well. And he was from the Art Students League. And I found that most of the guys from the Art Students League taught this same approach, and basically starting a certain way and going step by step through the painting so that you know each stage of the painting and how to control it. One of the difficulties I think most everybody has is there's always a stage in there where you think, this looks awful. How am I going to make this work? And what happens is that we don't know how to judge the success of the painting according to the stage it's in. A painting is like building a house, okay? You put a foundation down, and then you put up the framing, and you put the wiring and the plumbing, and you do all this, and then the wallboard, and then the windows, and the last thing you do, you start hanging curtains and that kind of thing. Well, most people, the first thing they want to do is hang the curtains. before they put down the foundation or done anything. And it collapses. And so also, because all they've got in mind is that final curtain hanging, everything up to that point looks like a failure to them. But you need to learn to judge, okay, the foundation, when I lay the foundation, if I'm a contractor, boy, I look at, boy, that is a beautiful foundation. It's level, it's smooth, it's flat, it's solid, and I can be satisfied and feel, okay, success. Instead of thinking, oh, that doesn't look like a house yet. Oh my gosh. And that's the way with a painting. People look at, oh, this doesn't look right. So learn what the steps are, what the stages are, so you can see that stage, say, yes, that's working, I'm on the right track. And my approach is, especially with smaller paintings, my approach is that in the first 20 or 30 minutes, I want to see that this is going to be a successful painting, that it's going to work, so that the next 2 or 3 hours, it's much more enjoyable. Because I've won the battle in the first 20 minutes, because it's the first 20 or 30 minutes that determines the success of the painting. And I'll show you basically how I do that when I do my demos. So let's start with the little slideshow here. I just want to give you a little bit of my approach to painting and how I teach. I think that there are objective rules and principles and truths behind art. It's not simply a subjective experience. It is that, but it's also objective. You don't have to have a unique talent or gift. Now, there's some people that do have unique talents and gifts that, fly above us all. But by and large, anybody with normal abilities, if they have the desire, can paint successfully, because essentially art is a craft that can be learned. And they're teachable, but you have to be motivated, just like in anything. So that's the key, is motivation. I've seen some very good artists that weren't motivated, that never accomplished anything. Some people that I thought shouldn't ever even be near a canvas were so fired up, they amaze me. And so it's all about desire and learning the right skills, because you take a craft, any craft, whether it's playing the piano or any kind of artistic endeavor, and you develop the skills level, and then there's a point that you transcend that craft, and it does become art, because it becomes an expression of you, because the craft is so ingrained. It just comes out. It's kind of like driving a car. At first, at least when I did, you had a clutch and the gas, you did all this, and it was so awkward. But after a while, you drive 1,000 miles and you forget about the fact you were driving. It's so automatic, and actually art can become that way. In painting and music, it becomes so ingrained. And so here's a good rule. Rules are the building blocks of creativity, not the stumbling blocks, okay? When I went to school, in art school, it was the very reverse of that. Oh, no rules, it'll stifle your creativity. That's the absolutely opposite view I take, and I think the way to go. By the way, this is a great poet, gave me this line. My wife, Cynthia, she's over here. She basically runs everything. Okay, so what we're going to talk about is the aesthetic categories and the systematic approach to painting. And the aesthetic categories are also referred to as divine setup. And that's because it's easy to remember. The D and the V, and then the SETUP are the 7 principles, or the 7 aesthetic categories we're going to talk about. And divine, it's the universal principles that we're talking about in terms of art, and they apply to theater, to music, to visual arts, to sculpture, to architecture, you name it. You know these, you can apply them to any area. And if all you got to do is remember divine setup, and you can remember what they are and the order they're in, because that was the one thing I did that was a little different than I'd seen before. I not only decided what the 7 basic ones had to be, but the order that you had to approach them in your consideration of your painting. and in the actual painting itself, and I'll explain that as we go. Because you begin the painting in your head by visualizing what it is you want based upon your subject matter. But you want to learn and train yourself to paint what you see so that you can paint what you want to see. But you have to have the skill to translate what you see out there to a canvas in order to have the ability to actually put your perspective on it and to paint what you want it to be, not necessarily what it is. Maybe hopefully better than what it is, otherwise why are you painting? Now there are many approaches to this. What's important is whatever approach you take, and the approach I'm talking about is what I developed for myself, but based on principles that I know lots of other teachers work with in one form or another. But the approach I take is systematic, and what's important is that you have a systematic approach, whatever it is. Not necessarily this one, but learn and develop a systematic approach. And what we're doing is basically simple and easy to remember, especially for the beginners. Now this systematic approach isn't really a formula, but it's just the application of classic art principles. And it's in an easy to remember, prioritized, consistent manner. And it sets up the painting to succeed from the beginning. And these principles are not meant to just be used in the painting process, but also in the thought process and considerations prior to even beginning the painting, and in the selection of the subject matter. The first principle is drawing/design. First consideration is drawing and design. Those two things alone are by far everything else is built on. Okay, you can't do enough drawing, and you can't do enough study of good design. The second is values. Blacks to whites, the second principle. The third is shapes. The fourth are edges. The fifth, temperature/color. Now, I do temperature rather than color because color people know pretty well. Color temperature is a lot more difficult. I focus on color temperature. Colors take care of themselves later. And most people are very sophisticated about color in our day. We've got so much color in our lives. But with temperature, judging it, that's more critical. And besides, I couldn't spell out divine setup if I used color. It'd be divine cup, set cup. That wouldn't work. Unity is the next one, and then perspective. And these are not intended to be, it is hierarchical in that there is a first consideration in an order, but the last two are not unimportant. But they're last because they are accomplished by how you do the others, the four above them, okay? Okay, design and composition. It's the primary element to determine the success of a painting. The paintings that are in the museums have great design. There are a lot of paintings that didn't get in the museums that were just as good in every other way. But the design is the critical factor. If it's not a good design, no matter how good a painter you are, it's going to be a weak painting. It's kind of like music. It's the composer that creates the music, not just the musician. And so no matter how well you do everything, that design has got to be there and be effective. And so in the kind of painting that I do, which is more or less center of interest painting, representational painting, you find a focal point, a center of interest, and you work out from there. Everything relates to it. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. First thing with the design, you need to tell one story in terms of the colors, values, subject matter, shapes, etc. If you have more stories to tell, do more paintings, but don't try to do too many stories or more than one basic story in one single painting. Avoid competing centers of interest. Here's an example. This is a painting I did several years ago. And it was in a show, and Scott Christensen, I don't know if you know him, he's a fantastic artist. He judged the show, and I went and asked him, I said, okay, could you give me a critique of the painting? And he said, well, of course he said it was a very nice painting and all that. He said the only problem with it, it had two centers of interest. It had this big red thing, and then her. And it's like, oh, which one, what's the story about? And I thought, wow, see, that's what I want a judge to do, is tell me why things don't work. Too many times I'll say, it just didn't touch me, and I think, thanks for that help. And so here, look what happens when I kill that one center of interest. It's still there, but I kill it, and now there's one story. It's all about her, okay? That's a good example of one center of interest. Your job is to direct the viewer through your painting. Here's a Rembrandt painting. Look at the way he directs you through that painting of those stairs. Isn't that incredible? You follow it away and you go all the way to the center of interest. He's got the man with the lightest light and the darkest dark area, the brightest colors, everything right there, and your eyes are led right to it. That's what you're trying to do. You don't even notice his secondary center of interest, which is another little guy sitting over here stoking a fire. But if he had played this up, then you go back and forth. But here you know. You need to enhance your focal point or center of interest by making it the highest contrast in the whole painting. The lightest lights and the darkest darks should be at or near your center of interest. The warmest warms and the coolest cool should be at or near your center of interest. The hardest and softest edges should be at or near your center of interest. The brightest and dullest should be, color-wise, should be near your center of interest. And the greatest detail should be there, preferably next to simple areas to contrast. So it's all about contrast to get your eye to the center of interest. And here's a great example. This is a Gainsborough painting. These two girls, now I didn't mention it earlier, one of the other things other than a visual quality is there's a psychological center of interest. And the psychological center of interest is human form or face is always going to draw your eye, okay? And so obviously the center of interest is the face in this painting. But notice the darkest dark in that painting. I wish we could darken the lights in here, you can see it better. But the darkest darks appear where? In her eyes. In her eyes, okay? And her eyes too. It may be right in here. And they're right against, what is the lightest light of the painting? Right around those eyes. Where's the warmest warm in the painting? Their lips. Right there. This is the center of interest. Where's the greatest detail? It's right there. Okay? Now notice how as you go, and you can't see it as well as I would like if we could darken the lights, but as you go away from this center of interest, further and further away, look how much the detail drops off. And the brush strokes become very subtle and less distinct until you look down at the hands. They are just simple little brush strokes. They're just almost like gesture drawing, but they're accurate. They're still accurate. But there's no detail. This isn't a painting about a little girl's hands. He doesn't want to distract you from the face by overdoing the hands. And think how much time it saves. How many times have you spent hours working on a little detail over in the corner of your canvas? Nobody cares about that detail. If your center of interest works, everything else can be very subtle and suggestive and looks much more painterly. But if you work the detail around the periphery of the painting to the same degree you do in the center of interest, it just looks labored and overworked. Okay? Here's another example. Homer, I think. Is that his name? Anyway, center of interest, no doubt. This painting is about these two boys. The lightest light and darkest dark, the most color. Look at the detail of the grass around. He didn't get down there and try to paint every little blade of grass. They're just blobs of color. Because you're not interested in this. You're interested in this. These are just supporting characters in a play. You don't want to put a spotlight on them, okay? And you save so much time. in a paint, instead of spending 10 hours on it, you can do it in 3 hours because you're not drawing every blade of grass. Okay, if the center of interest doesn't work, nothing works. That's the bottom line. So you need to consider the overall design as well as the center of interest, but how you get to that center of interest is important. So think of the overall design. There's several of them to consider. One is static. This is a static design, usually a pyramid, where it's as wide at the base and pointed at the top. Typical, most commonly done in portraits. A dynamic design. That's one where the major design elements are diagonals, strong diagonals. They're emphasized, strong diagonals running across here. Creates a dynamic design just by the fact of that diagonal shape. Another, strong diagonals emphasized here. It also has a line of reference that carries you from the shoulder right up through here, through there in the hat, and it creates a strong diagonal movement. There's even another one here. And also in terms of dynamic, it's not just the diagonals, but the nature of the brush strokes, strong contrast creates a very strong dynamic painting as well as the diagonals. Cruciform, basically any time when the major design elements cross and create an X or a cross somewhere. And you do this, you don't just necessarily pose it to be that way, but you find a design. The kid was leaning against a deal here, and he was actually selling hats, but he had maybe 1 or 2 hats sitting here. But I saw the cruciform. So I extended and made a bunch of hats to really strengthen that cruciform design. So you take what you've got and see, okay, what kind of design does that work with? And then you extrapolate. Here's another example. This is from a market. These people right here, this was really pretty much what the picture was. The fruit stand was nothing like that. But I saw this spiral beginning here. So I painted the fruit to create a spiral to bring it back, create that strong spiral movement to keep your eye in the scene. Same thing here. The background here wasn't anything like that, but I saw the spiral forming, and so I accentuated it with the shadows and so forth. It's not something that it jumps out at you and says, oh my gosh, look at the spiral. But it holds the painting together, okay? Creates a movement, you're controlling the eye. And there's asymmetry, where you have all the detail and interest in one part of the painting, and the other major portion of the painting, there's nothing or very little. And it also is, he was wearing a white t-shirt. Well, that's not very interesting. It actually was much more interesting just to have nothing there to play against the detail. So I saw, okay, this is asymmetrical design. Here's another example by a somewhat known pastelist from the past. But see what he did with this? This is just a big, flat nothing, but it's asymmetrical, all the actions in here, literally. Okay. Geometric. This scene was, a scene, it had some elements here, and I just accentuated all the geometric shapes in here, the repeated squares and rectangles and so forth, and accentuate them where I could. And here's the ultimate example of geometric design, of course, in Mondrian. So I'm going to just ask the question, what is the most important consideration in the design of a painting? That's an important one, yeah. Here's a design coming. Now there's a design. Before there was no design. But when I put that dot there, it becomes a design because that dot is now in relation to what? The edges of the canvas. So the most important single element in terms of design are the edges of the canvas, because everything is in a relationship to those fixed edges. So that's the most ignored, but yet the most important aspect of design is being conscious of your edges. And part of this flows right into the idea of the rule of thirds, which most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. Just dividing the canvas into thirds, vertically and horizontally. And the center of interest is always going to be, ideally, going to be found at one of these points. Where they intersect is generally, if you have a question, where should my center of interest be? The answer is 80% of the time, it's going to be where these points intersect or near it. Okay? I won't go into the physiological reasons, but this isn't an arbitrary decision made by an artist. It's really hard science behind why that particular place is. And we'll talk about it sometime later if anybody asks. Okay, here's an example. Here's the center of interest. It's hard to avoid that, right? I mean, that is in your face. And it's centered on the center of interest. The center of interest isn't necessarily a spot, it's an area. So, you know, an area of center of interest is that tree, but there is a secondary center of interest also on the third. This little grouping here of the only red in the whole picture. It's secondary to the tree. But I wouldn't want to make it obviously stronger, but then they compete. Here's another one. His psychological center of interest, the brightest colors, the warmest colors, the whitest whites, everything, all the action. This is center of interest. Nobody cares what's happening up here, except that it supports the center of interest, okay? Even in a portrait, same way. Where's her head? Third, center of interest. The most important part of a portrait is the triangle of their eyes down to their mouth. And that's right on the third, right there. Again, approximately third, right in there. That's where you're going to put your center of interest, and it's going to be most likely the most successful. Third, and it's a little higher than the third. If it is pushes a little bit, it's just a little more dramatic, but it's still safe. But if you put it somewhere else arbitrarily in there, it's much harder to make it work. Not that you can't. Here's that other pastelist, Degas. Just so happens that he puts the hottest, warmest color where? Right there. Third. Another Degas. Third. That's no accident. These guys were purposely doing this. And you look at the paintings in the museums, you'll see this over and over again. This is a Manet of Degas. Where's the center of interest? The head right there. Boom, boom. Another Manet. Center of interest. Even though this is bright white, the psychological center of interest overwhelms it. But it's still third.